My name is Cathy Moore. I'm just, honored to be a part of this group and, just want to be able to also learn more about a lot of the things that our patients have been suffering with, and where I fit into the piece of this puzzle is looking at the immune system through the gut and as well as balancing hormones just to optimize the patient's health and regards to preparing for stem cells. And so I love the microbiome. I think about 20 years ago when they did the Human Genome Project and looking at all the genes and looking at all the sequencing of that, thinking, oh, this is the ticket, this is where we're gonna figure out, how to, what genes are available and what diseases go with it. And then they realize that really, it all comes down to the microbiome and whether or not those genes get turned on or can remain off. You get your genes and there's just one way or the other is how they're expressing themselves. So much of our gut has to do with that, and our this ecosystem is just so beautiful, and realizing the fact that that our microbes outnumber our human cells 10 to 1, and the amount of good healthy flora that we have within us, and the microbiome itself weighs about anywhere between 4 to 8 pounds. And when you take just one single dose of an antibiotic, that's completely wiped out. And so recovering and trying to get back that integrity of the immune system is really vital. So the whole gut microbiome really bears the largest responsibility for keeping us healthy. So it's one of the #1 things in functional medicine. Hippocrates so eloquently said, all disease starts in the gut, and I find that to be true with most of my patients. So looking at how the gut can be disrupted and through taking antibiotics or just a poor diet, and so forth. I mean, there's multiple different symptoms of just the gastrointestinal stresses and so forth. And so, these are just basic things that even Carrie talked about, that we're looking for looking and understanding any kind of imbalances. And, so I see a lot of female patients, but I do have a fair amount of male population too, because their wives have sent their husbands in, you need to be seen. And so a lot of times there's, the wife is complaining of halitosis, or he's always gassing or bloating after meals, and females as well. And so looking at all of those gut symptoms and how they relate to one another. However, the most significant thing I find are more the systemic problems caused by dysbiosis. So when I see a lot of skin rashes, or I'm looking at, somebody comes in and they're talking about, their brain and this brain fog and this fatigue they get every afternoon, or, just increased anxiety and not being able to tolerate, different stresses that are coming in, to their lives and so forth. I usually draw this funnel-like analogy. And, I said, I know you're coming in to talk about your brain and what's happening with your brain, but, I want to know how you're pooping. And they're like, well, why do I need to know that? And so that's the most narrow portion of the funnel is the colon, and that's the most important organ to be able to have functioning well. And then if that's not functioning well, it backs up the liver and the kidneys. These are all major organs of detoxification for the body. When the liver and the kidneys get backed up, then the lymph gets backed up, and they're puffy and they've got edema and so forth. And then that's affecting the lymphatic system in such a way that the lymphatic system is the special, network of lymph system for the brain gets backed up, and that's why they're ending up with anxiety and depression and, and so forth. So looking at the big picture and, and so forth is just super important. And so so many of the autoimmune diseases and heart disease alike is causative of imbalance in our microbiome. So I really look at the reasons why, that we have these imbalances, and we talked about our, antibiotic use and how that destroys the microbiome, but as well, just our diet in general. And I think the standard American diet is the worst diet on the planet, and getting patients to go back to eating whole foods and using food as medicine is so important. So, the other big factor I see with dysbiosis is stress. And, there's a recent study in the last 10 years about the psychoneuroimmunology and how what you're thinking, your thoughts you have, the stress you have in your life, and how that's affecting your nervous system. And if your nervous system is stressed, that's going to affect your immune system. And so that way, that's how the gut will also be affected in different regards. We talked about stress, we talked about how, our thoughts and the quorum sensing that takes place between our gut microbiome and our brain, and how that travels through the vagus nerve. So when I talk to my patients about, what they can do to try to heal their gut, if you don't take their stress, so you can have the perfect protocol with herbs or homeopathy or whatnot to be able to help heal their gut. But if they're still super stressed out, their secretory IgA is still going to come back low or high. And it's a balance of the immune system to be able to get all of those aspects balanced in the body. I talk about the vagus nerve a lot in my practice because and those are different ways. I'll talk about different ways we can stimulate that, but that's like the gateway from the gut to the brain and how they connect with one another. So, SIBO, is anybody familiar with SIBO? Anybody treat SIBO? So, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. I've had so many patients with this, and I found really, and I want to talk a little bit about this, that from an elemental diet to following like low dose erythromycin and rifaximin and herbs and so forth. But what I find that really helps my patients get well are antiparasitics, and finding that in hanging out in the bile duct system can be a parasite that's decreasing the hydrochloric acid from being released to help them digest their food and inhibiting digestive enzymes. And so when I do a stool test and I don't find parasites, I'm still looking for different other markers that could be indicative of them having a parasitic infection that's suppressing their immune system. And so with fluoroquinolone toxicity, that's a big part of getting the patient well is renewing and reviving their immune system function to be able to thrive. So some of the symptoms of parasites, one of the pathognomic causes of parasites is psychiatric symptoms. And I see a ton of patients who come in with rashes and so forth. And so when I look at some of the basic, more standard, laboratory things I'm looking for, I'll go over as far as diagnosing them and so forth. But looking at some of these symptoms and, finding out, if their white blood cell count is perpetually low on the lower end, less than 5. Typically, I find that alkaline phosphatase, if that one is less than 80, that's showing more B6, magnesium, and zinc deficiencies, and those are what parasites love and thrive on. They're sitting very happy in the bile duct system, and you're feeding them all this good, healthy, nutritious food, and they're perpetually low in zinc, or B6, or they have high polyuria. Those are all markers and measurements of why we want to balance these things out. So, and then the other piece too of like when I see high steatocrit on a stool testing too, there's fat malabsorption happening, and that could be causative from a parasite or other infections. But then you have to start looking at, well, are they perpetually low in those other fat soluble vitamins, such as vitamin D, and no matter how much vitamin D you give them, their levels are still low. So we're looking at all of these things and how their body is detoxifying is really predominantly important with getting all of their organs of detoxification working properly, the colon, the liver, the kidneys, and the lymphatic system. Going back to just this schematic about how important the gut-brain axis is in handling some of these complex issues. 70% of our immune system is in our gut. 70% of our neurotransmitters are made in our gut. So when we're looking at the big picture and how all of these things interact with one another, from whether or not they have predominantly just gastrointestinal symptoms versus just brain symptoms, they all need to be balanced and looked at in a whole piece. So I know that with the vagus nerve, and I know with Ron doing the injections with the stellate ganglion, and how that dramatically has an effect on the nervous system in general, to be able to help patients be able to find peace inside their bodies and within their minds. So I just we'll go into some of the treatments for gut stuff, but I'm happy to be here and be with you all, and appreciate hearing your stories too, and we'll talk more about the treatment later on. Yeah.
What type of testing do you find is most accurate in trying to identify SIBO or fungal overgrowth parasites?
Predominantly, I just go less away from testing because I find them really inaccurate and it's a waste of money. So I'll go based on symptoms, you know, and just really treat patients that way. I find that some of the breath testing is very inaccurate. I know for sure that they've got some sort of SIBO and it comes back negative, and so it's a waste of money. It's discouraging for patients, and so, you know, if we just put our brains together to figure out like what are your symptoms and let's just treat it, see what happens. You know, I think patients are more open to that and not wasting their money on expensive testing that ends up it's not always accurate. Yeah.
Cathy, do you ever use anti-parasitics empirically to just treat because of your clinical impression?
Yes.
And what do you like to use?
So I tend to talk to the patient because some patients, they just want to go pharmaceutically wise and just get an antiparasitic. They're very expensive here in the States. So we have them go to Canada to get some of the prescriptions and go through a series of different, you know, prescriptions and so forth. The linea, you know, and it depends on their coverage and so forth, but you know, one patient could go and get their prescription filled for a linea and pay their $10 copay. Another patient's going to pay $1,500 for treatment. So then I said, well, go to Canada and get your prescription that way. So if patients want to go through like more of the pharmaceutical drugs, then I'll prescribe those, and we'll go in a series of, you know, 3 different kinds of antiparasitics. And then if I do love the herbals a lot, and find that sometimes I can jumpstart the body by doing an antiparasitic and then finish with herbals. But it's typically a 6-month treatment of dealing with that until, because I mean, this is commonly something that most people think about. This is a third world issue, right? Parasites are, and it's not. They're very prevalent, and I find that I can't really get patients well. I keep hitting a roadblock, you know. Then we look at, you know, parasites being something that's underlying cause, but particularly with Lyme too. I mean, that's something that I don't think patients can fully recover from Lyme unless, you know, they've been treated for parasites. They're macroscopic organisms, so it makes sense to start with the things that are macroscopic, that are actually helping us by gathering up, you know, any kind of bacteria, viruses, heavy metals, mold, hormones, you know. So if you deal with things on a macroscopic level and then start to deal with the viruses and bacteria that are smaller, I think patients get better quicker. And they have less fixing, you know, too, so just having any kind of side effects.
One thing I wanted to mention in terms of the herbal antiparasitics, one is called wormwood. And wormwood is artesunate. It's actually a cousin to the fluoroquinolone, and I've seen patients who take even those herbs end up relapsing or feeling much worse doing so. So I think it's a very important note to mention. That's all perfect, again, for the normal person, but when you're exposed to Cipro, levoquin, or flogs, it's kind of, there's a few things kind of be careful of, just to bring up to a patient, especially like wormwood.
Yeah, I use
Wormwood, so
Artemisium.
Yeah.
I use a lot of Mimosa pudica seed.
Awesome.
So I find that to be very, very effective, and I use some noni and neem. So for, you know, those kind of blends of herbs. But yeah, and there's a lot of patients too that are really sensitive to some of the herbs because they're also, their immune system's compromised and they're allergic to, you know, black walnuts and different kinds of, so, you know, and I do some energetic testing too, just to see what's going to resonate with that patient's, you know, system and so forth, to be able to find if they have 3 different, you know, antiparasitics. I'm going to, you know, use some energetic testing with the autonomic nervous system to figure out what's going to be best for them in their body. So I'm also going to share a little bit about hormones, just you can't talk about, you know, so if Ron sends me patients with wanting him to balance their hormones and so forth, I'm not gonna start out with treating them with bioidentical hormones, you know, to get their system working well, to be able to prepare for stem cells. The gut is so intricately involved with helping to make hormones and process hormones that we've got to treat the gut first. And so, you know, with looking at hormones and how those are processed, and the important part about, you know, helping patients in balance with all levels and all organ systems, you know, we look at different ways about how the sex hormones in the gut and the microbial composition and the immune system responds. and how the different things in our environment and genetics and how that's going to vary different things. And so the two different layers of, testosterone and estradiol, and how that's going to affect our dendritic cells to releasing inflammatory cytokines. And when you have any kind of gut dysbiosis, those gap junctions are opened up, and that can cause also some inflammation in the body. And the whole goal with our flox patients is to decrease inflammation. So starting with the gut and being able to get things working in symphony, that's what we want, is everything working in symphony, not cacophony. It starts with being able to balance those things out. I find that, with looking at how hormones are working and the studies that have come out now with 2G and 3G, they've done, studies about this for the last 20 years, and some of the most recent research that's come out, and how electromagnetic fields are disrupting our hormones. And if you think about that, our electrical conduction system of our heart, we can slap pads on there and it'll read out our heart rate and, our own electric conduction. And if you're constantly having and being bombarded with other electrical things, such as wireless devices, even your refrigerator and your stove, those are all electronic devices that are bombarding your system. That's going to create an imbalance, and that's also going to create some inflammation in the body as well. I do a fair amount of preconception, counseling, and talk so much to patients about the effects of EMFs on our hormones, and to be able to balance those out. And particularly when we're treating, hormones, I want people to be aware of this so that we can try to minimize the effects on the body hormonally. And I see consistently elevated levels of oxidized, cholesterol, high levels of cholesterol in very young people. And if you think about that, in regards in this insulin resistance epidemic that we're having with blood sugars, leptin resistance, and all of the infertility, the rise of infertility because of the effects on the EMFs and how that messes with our hormonal system is really debilitating for many people. So when I'm looking at treating hormones, I'm treating the gut, I'm looking at what can we do to decrease inflammation, and EMFs are a big part of that. So some of the things I'm also looking for to help balance the hormones is looking at some of these deficiencies. And for nutrients, we're looking at, I like to run, sometimes I'll run the Great Plains tox screen to look at other toxins that they've been exposed to that could be also inhibiting their body's ability to recover. And heavy metals, we talked about before, like parasites are going to house heavy metals for us, and keep those away from our body. They're stored in our fat. And so when you're doing a detoxification and you're cleaning the body out and starting to eat new foods, the body's going to detoxify. Well, heavy metals are going to be released with that too. So I typically will get a whole blood aluminum, cadmium, arsenic, and mercury levels. And we're not able to, part of what happened with the medical board is that, we used to be able to provoke these, and I still do in some cases, but we have to make a case for whether or not they've had exposure to heavy metals, and then you can do the provocation afterwards. But I think anything that's above detectable limits for heavy metals is going to cause inflammation in the body, and that's going to inhibit hormones from working properly. And then obviously looking for other infections that could be underlying some of the immunosuppression that takes place when patients are exposed, to different inflammatory conditions. We talked a little bit about blood sugar, but I feel like this is kind of like the silent disease in regards to blood pressure. You don't know you have high blood pressure. You don't feel that unless it's like super high. But same thing for blood sugar. I have so many patients come in where their fasting blood sugar is 99, and that's prediabetes. And so if we don't get that under control, especially too with the Fox patients, that is another marker of inflammation. So as we're working on diet and we're working on cleaning the gut up, balancing the blood sugar is vitally important, in order for us to be able to get all of our hormone systems working properly. So oftentimes what I will, typically do is I'll have, and check, the fasting glucose levels. And then if that's elevated, then we'll look at fasting insulin. I'll look at different markers for the hemoglobin A1C, which is a measurement of your blood sugar over the last 3 months. And then what I'll start to have patients do is I will have them check their fasting blood sugar and, you know, see what their basic baseline is in the morning, get them a little glucometer, and then have them check every, you know, an hour, half hour to an hour after they eat. And if anything that rises above 20 points, then I want them to stay away from that food for at least 30 days, you know, so that they can begin to get their blood sugars back in balance. And intermittent fasting and fasting, water fasting, that all works amazing too, to be able to help balance those things out in the body. One of the things that Ron wanted me to talk about was a little bit about low-dose immunotherapy. And if you're not familiar with that, it's a homeopathic dilution. So Helen was a physician in India that basically figured out like treats like. And so if somebody has strep throat, then and they came in, you know, to do some sort of homeopathy, they're going to give them a diluted dose of strep to be able to. And so similar to like how vaccines were you know, made, where you're giving them a small dose of what, you know, they could be exposed to allow immune response to take place. And so LDI is just a very diluted dose of an antigen in particular. And so in looking at, you know, just a little bit about the history about it, there's Dr. Leonard McGowan, who started in the 1960s with enzyme potentiated desensitization. And William Schrader, he developed after using his products, he developed low-dose antigen therapy instead of doing immunotherapy, you know, like with, you know, different kinds of injections that patients do for seasonal allergies and whatnot. And then Ty Vincent said, well, if we can take and we can have an agent, like giving patients a diluted dose of homeopathic agent for allergies, and it was, you know, very successful. He's like, why couldn't we do that for infections? So then Ty Vincent came out with, you know, low-dose immunotherapy. So patients who have Lyme disease, we're giving them diluted doses of Lyme that's 1 million times diluted out. And so as I was talking with Ron about a lot of our, you know, Fox cases, I started thinking about, well, if this is, you know, and this is just exploratory in my mind, and I'd love to hear feedback from what you think too, but, you know, if this is an immune system reactivity in the body that takes place when somebody takes Cipro, could that potentially be reversed if we did a low dose, you know, immunotherapy with the actual antibiotic diluted out 1 million times? How would that work in the body and the response to it? So, you know, I have gathered and put together, you know, different low-dose immunotherapies with, you know, Avalox and levofloxacin and Cipro. A lot of times patients don't even know that they've, you know, which one they've taken. So how would you know which one to give? And so this is something that I've been thinking in my mind about how low-dose immunotherapy could be involved with some treatment, you know, modalities for patients who have fluoroquinolone toxicity. And so it's basically working to, you know, with the immune system's reaction to this. And so Ron wanted me to bring up and mention about that and how that could potentially be, you know, something that we could, you know, look into for treatment.
Yeah. I actually read there was a doctor named Manfred Mueller. He was, you know, he coined it homeocipro or homeolevocin, and he took like a very, very limited dose and added it to whatever else, and he put his pill form in. I don't know the outcomes, but I have heard a few years ago that he tried it.
Interesting.
It's tough when you get prescribed this and you know that's what it is. It's hard to get a patient to say
Exactly.
You know, it scares me, so that's why I never tried it.
We're afraid of fluoride toothpaste.
Yeah, right. Right.
Yeah.
No fluoride! Don't put that in my kid's mouth.
But,
Yeah.
like, I mean, the light cure is standard, you know, and it does work for a lot of things, so it makes sense, but I don't know how I'm going to do
Right, and there's only like it's only the energetic properties left of the medication that's in the product because it's diluted out so many millions of times. And so, you know, and that's the same thing too for anybody who's had Lyme disease. It's no different. You know, we're giving them a diluted dose of 20 different strains of Borrelia and 74 different strains of all the co-infections. You know, it's you know, it's hard to wrap your brain around understanding that and, you know, thinking about that. And for me as well, being Western minded trained, You know, it's something that, you know, that I started to think about when looking at some of these patients. And so I haven't tried this on anybody, but, you know, it's something that I think it could be something that could be something for, you know, to help patients with their symptoms. And I mean, it's almost miraculous in some ways. When I have a patient who's debilitated and suffered with Lyme and wakening 10 times a night because they're just in so much pain, and I give them one dose of, you know, if I hit the mark and give them the right dilution, they sleep through the night and they feel like it's a miracle and they're back to normal for like 1 to 2 days. And then we, you know, go on and figure out, okay, well, what is their therapeutic dose and how we need to get to that so it lasts longer and continues to retrain the T regulatory cells, you know, how to respond to the antigen that you're giving them. So I don't know, it's interesting. I'll have to look that up. I'd love to read about what this other doctor's done.
I mean, I've only known like 2 people, and I didn't hear any positive results that actually have now come from doing his treatment. So
Yeah.
He has a website too.
yeah.
Can I just clarify technicality, just as a homeopath, it's just painful to hear.
Yeah.
So it's taking homeopathically prepared, remedies, but using them isopathically. So you're not looking at the symptom picture and say like treats like, although some classical homeopath might, you're treating the disease that the person has organically with the energetic form of that same disease. So it's isopathics. It's not like treats like, it's same to same.
Mm-hmm.
So like would be you take a whole symptom picture, mental, physical, spiritual, and you match it to that person and give them a remedy that matches that. It could be a plant or flower, sunshine, it could be anything,
Mm-hmm.
but it might not be the disease, that disease substance. But it doesn't mean it doesn't work.
Sure.
I mean, classical homeopaths use nosodes all the time, which are, nosodes are those things that are from diseased tissue,
Mm-hmm.
and they also use the pathogen too. So I wouldn't be afraid of it, just as a homeopath. There really is nothing there, but I could see where I would be afraid.
Yeah.
I would be.
How often are you seeing Lyme with biopsies? And are you testing for Lyme, or
Yeah.
do you Western blot?
No, I don't.
What do you use?
So there's Chris can talk about this too, but there's a lot of different labs out there. Lyme is really difficult to diagnose,
I know,
and
that's why I'm wondering.
it doesn't hang out in the blood. It's in the organ systems,
Right.
It's in the white matter. So, there's a couple different tests, and Chris can talk about another one, but DNA connections. And Marco Ruggiero and Dietrich Klinghardt put together this protocol for, where because these, the bacteria hide in the organ systems, you have to provoke it in some way or another. So using therapeutic ultrasound and figuring out what organ systems this is hiding, and then you collect the urine for, 6 to 8 hours after. So that's one way of testing. IGeneX is another lab that's, has a good reputation for looking for Lyme and the Lyme co-infections. I don't find the Western blot to be very helpful in most of my patient population.
It's pretty worthless.
There was I don't know if any of you saw it, I think it was 2 weeks ago now, Johns Hopkins, Dr. Zhang's lab has now come up with a new and improved serology, effectively a turbocharged Western blot. And in the press release, his associate actually said in the press release that everybody knows for the last 25 years the Western blot has been worthless. It was breathtaking that he actually said that.
Yeah.
I'm sure there were people in third-party payer communities that were just gasping when he said that.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, there's a lot of things, a lot of theories and whatnot, but